A fat man in velvet thrusts a sealed scroll at the sobbing mother. According to the contract, her 7-year-old son is to be sold into slavery for 12 years. The guards stare at the ground. Then a stranger in odd clothing rises from the bench of shame and says he wants to look at the document. A second before that, Daniel Archer opens his eyes and sees the sky. Murky, yellow, not the office ceiling, not the white light of the ICU. His skull feels as if someone were squeezing it with both hands. The smell of hay hits his nose. Manure. Fear. He is lying on a wooden bench in the middle of a dusty square, and all around him stand people in museum-style clothing, coarse fabrics, leather aprons, bare feet. He looks at his hands. The same ones. The same scar from a paper cut he got in 2014 while signing the merger of 2 pharmaceutical giants. His hands. Everything else is foreign. In the center of the square stands a stone pillar with iron rings. A pillory. To the right, a woman is sobbing and clutching a boy of about 7 to her chest. Looming over her is a fat man in a velvet doublet, jabbing a scroll in her face. The contract is clear. If the debt is not paid, the son goes into service for 12 years. The guild seal is there. The signature is there. The law is the law. The woman shakes her head but does not object. No one objects. The guards stare at the ground. And this is where what never went away in Dane kicks in. He doesn't understand where he knows this language from. He hears words he never learned and understands them as if they were his own. But the pain is real. The mother's tears are real. The boy's eyes, in which childhood is already gone, are real. Dan looks at the scroll, and suddenly he sees the text. Not with his eyes. He sees it like a lawyer who spent 12 years reading documents where every comma was worth millions. Point 3. The definition of non-payment is vague. There is no specific amount. Only words about the remaining portion. A portion of what? Of the debt. Of the penalties. Of the interest on the penalties. Clause 5 contradicts Clause 8. There's a signature, but no date. Dan stands up. His legs are wobbly, his head is buzzing, but the mechanism is already in motion. 12 years in the negotiating room have taught him one thing. If you see a weak contract, don't stay silent. Stand up and tear it to shreds. He approaches the fat man. The man sizes him up from head to toe. Foreign, thin fabric, shoes without buckles, no coat of arms, no seal, no one. Dan asks for the document. The fat man laughs and asks who this ragged beggar is to dare meddle in the guild's affairs. Dan doesn't answer. He reaches out and snatches the scroll. The square falls silent. He unfolds the parchment and reads aloud, slowly, with a pause at every point, as if dictating to a junior partner in an office on the 42nd floor. The first point mentions non-payment, but doesn't specify the amount. What exactly does the remaining portion refer to? The loan or the interest? The fat man turns crimson. His name is Garwine. For 20 years he's been squeezing this town with usury, and no one has ever asked him such questions. Dan keeps going. Clauses 5 and 8 contradict each other. In case of a contradiction, the clause in favor of the weaker party applies. And the weaker party here is the mother and the 7-year-old child. How many hours of the child's labor do 3 silver coins cover? Silence. No one is breathing. The guards look up. The mother stops crying and looks at Dan as if he were a man who had descended from the sky. He holds the scroll up to the light and sees something he cannot explain. A red glow burns over the parchment, dim but distinct. Red means a lie. Red means a hole. Where does this knowledge come from? He doesn't know. But it feels as natural as the ability to read. There is no date of signing on the document. And that means, by any trade charter he knows, this is not a contract. It is a draft. Garwine backs away. His face turns pale. He shouts that the stranger is not a member of the guild, and his words are empty. And then Dan does what changes everything. He grabs a goose quill from the bench. A thin golden line appears on the back of his palm, slowly, over an old office scar, as if someone were signing his name directly onto his skin with an invisible pen. He isn't afraid. He has no time for that. He bites his thumb and squeezes a drop of blood into the scribe's inkwell. The blood mixes with the ink. The golden line flashes. He writes on the back of the scroll. The document is insignificant. A debt to the mother, 3 silver coins. Term, 1 year. Guarantor, Daniel Archer. The son remains with his mother. The pen squeaks. The final dot. The scroll flashes gold and fades. The parchment in Garvine's hands crumbles to ash. The merchant takes a step toward Dan and falls to his knees. Not out of fear. His legs simply give out. He tried to break the new contract before he realized it already existed. The square is silent. The mother hugs her son so tightly that the boy's ribs crack. The guards keep their eyes fixed on Dan. He wipes the blood on his trouser leg and looks at the golden line. It glows evenly and calmly. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know how he got here. He doesn't know what this line means, or where his gift for seeing lies in other people's papers comes from. But one thing he knows for sure. He needs an office. Garvin got up from his knees after 3 minutes. His legs returned to him slowly, as if after a long illness. He looked at Dan with an expression Dan had seen many times in Manhattan boardrooms. It was the face of a man who had just lost and was already calculating how to win back what he'd lost. Garwin said nothing. He turned and walked away. 2 of his servants ran after him. The square began to come alive. People were talking quietly and quickly. Someone was pointing at Dan. Someone was pulling children away. The mother stood before him, unable to speak. Her name was Martha. She was short and thin. Her dress had been altered so many times that it was impossible to tell its original color. The boy's name was Tom. He looked up at Dan, his eyes round as coins. Martha sank to her knees. Dan told her to stand up. She didn't stand up. She took his hand and pressed it to her forehead. He felt her tears running down his fingers. Warm. Real. In Manhattan, clients would say thank you and leave to drink champagne. Here, a woman was kissing his hand because her son would stay with her. Dan gently lifted Martha off her knees. He said she had nothing to thank him for. He had simply read the document. Martha shook her head. She said that no one in this town reads documents. Everyone just signs them. The guards finally decided to approach. There were 2 of them. One was old, with a gray beard and a broken nose. The other was young and nervous. The older one introduced himself. His name was Holt, and he was the sheriff of Havenrest. He asked Dan who he was and where he came from. Dan replied that he was a lawyer. Holt didn't understand the word. Dan thought for a second and said he was a notary, a scribe. Holt frowned. He said there were no available scribes in Haven Rest. All notaries work for the Cross Guild. Dan asked who Cross was. Holt fell silent. Then he looked around and quietly said that Lord Wayland Cross was the head of the County Notary Guild. He controls all contracts, all debts, all deals. Dan nodded. He understood. Every town has its own cross, a man who has the system by the throat. Holt asked where Dan would spend the night. Dan looked around. He had no money. He had nothing but clothes that looked like an alien suit here. Martha intervened. She said there was a shed by the temple. It was dry and warm. She would take him there herself. Dan wanted to refuse, but Martha had already taken him by the sleeve and was pulling him across the square. Tom walked beside them, holding his mother's skirt. The temple turned out to be a small stone building with a crooked roof. Inside it smelled of wax and something bitter. The shed stood behind the temple. Wooden walls, a straw mat on the floor, a single window without glass. Martha left and returned half an hour later. She brought a pot of hot soup and an old woolen blanket. She said the blanket had belonged to her husband. Her husband had died 2 years ago. The treatment contract he'd signed with the doctor turned out to be a forgery. The doctor took the money and vanished. Her husband died of the fever a week later. Dan listened in silence. The soup was watery and bland, but it was his first meal in this world, and he ate every last drop. Martha left. Dan lay down on the straw and stared at the ceiling. Through the cracks in the boards, he could see the stars. Strange stars. Not a single familiar constellation. He raised his hand. The golden mine on the back of his palm glowed faintly in the darkness. He tried to recall the last seconds of his former life. A crosswalk, 3 a.m, headlights, a crash. He had died on the asphalt of Manhattan, 3 blocks from his office. And he woke up here, on a bench in the middle of a city that didn't exist on any map of the world he knew, with a magical seal on his hand and the ability to read other people's contracts. He closed his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead of sleep, thoughts came, concrete and cold. Right. The situation is as follows. Point 1. He is in an unknown place with no resources, no connections, and no understanding of the local legal system. Point 2. He has an ability that holds real power in this world. The contracts he certifies become unbreakable. Point 3. This ability makes him valuable, and therefore dangerous. Garvin has already left, and Garvin isn't the type to leave just like that. Point 4. He needs information. He needs to understand how the local system works, what laws are in effect, who makes the decisions, who owns the land, who controls the money. Point 5. He needs allies, at least one person he can trust. In the morning, he'll find Holt. In the morning, he'll start asking questions. But for now, he needs to sleep. Morning came quickly. The sun beat through the crack between the boards and hit him right in the eye. Dan sat up. His back ached from the straw. His mouth was dry. He stepped out of the barn and saw a boy sitting by the door. Tom. The boy was sitting on the ground, waiting. He said his mom had sent him to show Dan where the well was. Dan washed his face with cold water from a wooden bucket. The water was clear and smelled of iron. Tom stared at him intently. Then he asked if it was true that Dan was a wizard. Dan said no. He said he was just a man who could read. Tom thought for a moment and said it was all the same. Dan couldn't help but smile. Maybe the boy was right. He found Holt in the guardhouse, a small room with a single table and 2 chairs. A hand-drawn map of the town hung on the wall. Haven Rest, a border town, a population of about 2,000, 3 main streets, the market square, the temple, the guild hall, a bridge across the river. Beyond the river lay Baron Torvald's lands. Holt spoke willingly. He was tired. For 20 years he had been sheriff in a town where the law belonged to those who paid to have it written. Every contract in Haven Rest went through the Cross Guild. Every debt, every deal, every marriage. The guild took a cut of everything, and what it couldn't take as a cut, it took in people. Children sold into servitude, lands seized through usurious loans, workshops shut down under false pretexts. Holt spoke quietly and avoided eye contact. He was ashamed. He knew it was all wrong, but he didn't have the tools to stop it. He was a man with a sword in a world where those with pens won. Dan listened and took it all in. His mind worked just as it had in Manhattan when he was preparing for a major case. Gather information, identify the key players, find weaknesses in the opponent's position, develop a strategy. He asked Holt if there was a scribe available in town, not from the guild. Holt thought for a moment. He said there was one, old Bryn. He used to be a court scribe, but was fired for refusing to sign a false record. Now he lives on the outskirts and makes ends meet by writing letters for those who can't write themselves. Dan asked Holt to take him to Bryn. They walked through the city, and Dan looked around. Haven Rest was poor. The houses were old and cramped. The roofs were leaking. The streets were dirty. But people lived there. They traded at the market. They washed clothes in the river. They forged iron in the smithy. The city breathed, heavily and hoarsely, but it breathed. Bryn lived in a house that looked more like a closet. 1 room, a table piled high with papers, a shelf with inkwells, the smell of old parchment. Bryn was over 60, thin, stooped. His hands trembled, but his eyes were sharp and attentive. He looked at Dan and asked if it was true that he had destroyed Garvain's contract yesterday. Dan said it was true. Bryn smiled. For the first time in a long while, judging by how unusual it looked on his face, he said he'd like to see that. Dan asked if he could rent a room in Bryn's house. He explained that he had no money but was willing to work. He said he needed a place to work, a desk, paper, ink. Bryn looked at him for a long time. Then he said there was a desk, there was paper, there was ink, there was a corner, and the money could wait. Dan held out his hand. Bryn shook it. And in that moment of the handshake, Dan felt something he couldn't put into words. A brief, silent snapshot. Intention. Bryn was honest. Absolutely and completely. There wasn't a shred of lies in him. Dan squeezed his hand a little tighter. He had found his first ally. On the 3rd day, Dan's first client came to him, or rather, a woman came, a short woman with tired eyes and calluses on her palms. She was a laundress. Her name was Helga. She came because Martha had told her about the man who had destroyed Garvain's contract. Helga brought a scroll with her. She unrolled it on Dan's table, her hands trembling. The contract was for the rental of the space where she did laundry for the townspeople. The landlord had tripled the rent overnight, citing a clause regarding the right to renegotiate. Helga couldn't pay. In a week, she would be out on the street. Dan took the scroll. A red glow appeared immediately, bright and menacing. The clause regarding the right to revise the terms was written so that the landlord could change the price at any time without restrictions. But Dan read on. The clause regarding the notice period required 30 days' notice. The landlord had given 3, a violation. Moreover, the seal on the contract was the guild's, and guild contracts, according to local custom, required the signatures of 2 witnesses. There was only 1 witness. Dan explained to Helga that the contract could be contested on 2 grounds, but he didn't destroy it. Instead, he wrote a new one. Rent under the previous terms. Term, 5 years. Price adjustments no more than once a year and by no more than 1/10. He bit his finger. A drop of blood fell into the ink. A golden line flashed. Helga signed. Dan certified it. The old contract darkened and crumbled. Helga cried. Dan poured her some water. Bryn sat in the corner and watched it all with the expression of a man who had witnessed a miracle. After Helga came the blacksmith. After the blacksmith came the baker. After the baker came a widow with 3 children. Each carried their own contract. Every contract was rotten. A red glow burned above each scroll. Dan worked all day. By evening, his eyes ached and his finger was swollen from the pricks. He sealed 7 new contracts and destroyed 7 old ones. Bryn recorded every case. His hands no longer trembled. In the evening, Dan sat on the threshold of Bryn's house and watched the sunset, orange and heavy. Martha walked by with a pot of soup. She left it at the door and walked away without saying a word. Tom waved at Dan and ran after his mother. Dan ate the soup and thought. 7 contracts in one day. 7 families who would breathe easier today. But Garvain isn't the only loan shark in town, and the Cross Guild won't stay silent. He's ruining their business. Every contract destroyed is a blow to their wallet. The question isn't whether they'll come after him. The question is when. On the 4th day, she arrived. Tall, red-haired, a scar across her left eyebrow, a leather jacket with metal patches, a sword at her belt. A hunter. She walked into Bryn's house without knocking. She looked at Dan. She looked at Bryn. She looked at the table piled high with scrolls. She said her name was Seraphina Ride. She said she needed a verifier, not a guild one. Dan offered her a seat. She remained standing. She pulled a scroll from her bosom, old, worn. The edges were scorched. She placed it on the table and said it was a contract for authorized hunting. 3 years ago, under this contract, a group of people had been granted the right to hunt on Baron Torvald's lands. Among the game listed in the contract were wolves and bears. But the hunters didn't kill a wolf or a bear. They killed her younger brother. He was 17. He worked as a guide on those lands. The hunters claimed they mistook him for a poacher. The contract gave them the right to detain poachers, but the wording was broader. It included the word eliminate. The local clerks refused to investigate. The guards closed the case. The guild confirmed that the contract was valid. Seraphina had spent 3 years looking for someone who would look at this scroll and tell the truth. Dan took the contract. A red and black glow struck his eyes so brightly that he squinted for a second. Black. Forgery or coercion. He looked closer. The contract had been altered after it was signed. The word detain had been erased and eliminate written over it. The alteration was subtle, professional. But Dan saw what no ordinary person could see. He saw the difference between the original text and what had been written over it. A golden glow beneath the black, like old text showing through the new. He told Serafina that the contract had been forged. A word had been changed after it was signed. That's a crime. Serafina didn't move. Only her hands clenched into fists so that her knuckles turned white. She asked if he could prove it. Dan nodded. He wrote a report, detailed and precise. He described the erasure. He described the difference between the original text and the altered one. He sealed the report with his blood. A golden line flashed. He handed Serafina the sealed report and told her that with this document, she could go to any court on the continent. His seal was unbreakable. Serafina took the document. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Dan. She asked how much he wanted for the job. Dan said nothing. Serafina shook her head. She said there's no such thing as a free service. Everything has to be paid for. Dan thought for a moment. Then he said he needed someone to protect him, because they'd be coming for him soon, and he didn't know how to fight. Serafina looked at him for 10 seconds. Then she said she needed a contract. Dan wrote the contract on a single sheet of paper. Serafina Ride agrees to protect Daniel Archer. Daniel Archer agrees to conduct a full investigation into the circumstances of her brother's death and bring those responsible to justice. The contract is valid until the investigation is complete. Payment for security services is to be covered by Archer's firm, subject to available funds. Serafina read it. She said that the clause about payment subject to available funds was a very polite way of saying for free. Dan replied that it was a very honest way of saying he didn't have a single penny right now. Serafina almost smiled. Almost. They signed. Dan sealed it with blood. The golden line flashed twice, once when he signed and once when she signed, and the moment she signed, Dan received a snapshot, silent and brief. Serafina's intention was simple and pure. She wanted the truth. Only the truth. 3 years of pain condensed into a single word. Serafina nodded. She tucked her copy of the contract into her bosom. She adjusted the sword at her belt and stood by the door, back to the wall, facing the entrance, as if she had stood that way her whole life. Bryn looked at Dan and quietly said that things were looking up. Dan looked at his swollen finger and thought he needed to find a less painful way to sign documents. But that could wait, because footsteps could be heard outside, heavy and steady. The footsteps of people accustomed to marching in formation. Serafina placed her hand on her sword. Bryn turned pale. Dan stood up from the table. 4 men entered the room. Leather armor, short swords, an emblem on their sleeves, a quill and scales. The Cross Guild. The eldest of the 4 was a broad-shouldered man with a flat face and empty eyes. He said he had come on Lord Cross's behalf. Lord Cross invites the unregistered verifier to a meeting. Refusal of the invitation will be considered disrespect toward the guild. Dan looked at him, then at Serafina. She stood calmly, but her fingers on the sword hilt were white. Dan said he would accept the invitation, but not today. He said that according to the rules of business etiquette he knew in his world, an invitation to a meeting must be sent in writing 3 business days in advance. He added that he would be happy to receive an official letter specifying the date, time, place, and agenda of the meeting. The four exchanged glances. The elder said that Lord Cross did not write letters. Lord Cross invites, and people come. Dan nodded. He said he understood, but he was not people. He was a guarantor, and he had a schedule. This week, it was full. The elder took a step forward. Seraphina took half a step and found herself between him and Dan. Her sword remained in its sheath, but her eyes said everything that needed to be said. The elder stopped. He looked at her. He looked at Dan. He turned and walked out. The other three followed him. Silence. Bryn exhaled. His hands were trembling again. Seraphina turned to Dan and said that he was either very brave or very stupid. Dan replied that in his past life, those two qualities had been mandatory requirements for getting hired. The next morning, Dan woke up to the smell of mint. A cup of hot herbal tea sat on the table. A note lay next to it. The handwriting was small and neat. The note said that the tea reduced swelling and disinfected minor wounds. It is recommended to drink it in the morning. The signature read, Han Ji-un, Pharmacy on Mill Street. Dan looked at his swollen finger and picked up the cup. The tea was bitter and smelled of mint and something else sharp. 10 minutes later, his finger hurt noticeably less. He asked Bryn who Han Ji-un. Bryn said she was a pharmacist, the only one in town, a descendant of settlers from the eastern archipelago. A quiet woman, smart. She lives alone.
For many years, her pharmacy has been burdened by a tax that the former mayor devised specifically for her. The mayor wanted to take the pharmacy building. It's in a prime location near the market. Ji-un held her ground. She paid. But the tax has been rising every year, and soon she won't be able to pay. Dan finished his herbal tea and told Seraphine that they were heading to Mill Street. The pharmacy turned out to be a small building squeezed between a blacksmith shop and a cobbler's. The door was low. Inside, it smelled of herbs and sulfur. Dozens of jars filled with dried plants and powders lined the shelves. A woman stood behind the counter. She was short. Her dark hair was tied back in a bun. She wore rock crystal glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Her lab coat was stained with some kind of chemical. She looked at Dan calmly, without surprise, without fear. She said she was glad the decoction had helped. She had seen him yesterday in the square while he was working with clients, and noticed that he pricked his finger every time. She said that if he planned to continue in the same vein, he wouldn't have any fingers left in a month. She offered a special needle, a thin one, made from sea urchin bone. The prick is almost painless and heals in minutes. Dan said he would gratefully accept the offer. Then he asked about the tax. Ji-un fell silent. Her expression didn't change, but her hands on the counter tensed slightly. She asked how he knew. Dan said Bryn had told him. He added that if she brought him the tax code, he'd see what could be done. Ji-un looked at him for 10 seconds. Then she went into the back room and returned with a thick folder. She silently placed it on the counter. Dan took the folder. He studied it all day. Bryn helped. He explained the local tax system, who makes the decisions, how the city council votes, what quorum is required to pass a new tax. By evening, Dan had found what he was looking for. The pharmacy tax had been passed by the city council 8 years ago. A quorum of 7 votes out of the 12 council members was required for passage. There were 7 signatures on the meeting minutes. But one of the signatures belonged to a man who had been dead for 3 months at the time of the vote. Dan showed this to Bryn. Bryn looked at the minutes, and his eyes widened.
He said he knew that man. Old Councilman Thorne. He died in the spring, and the vote had taken place in the summer. Someone had forged his signature. Without that signature, there was no quorum. Without a quorum, the decision was invalid. Without a decision, the tax did not exist. Dan came to the pharmacy the next morning. He placed his analysis in front of Ji-yoon. He explained everything. The forgery of the dead counselor's signature, the lack of a quorum, the legal nullity of the tax. 8 years.
For 8 years, she had been paying a tax that didn't exist. Ji-yoon took off her glasses. She wiped them with the hem of her robe. She put them back on. Her hands weren't shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. She asked if he could certify it. Dan drafted a document, short and precise. Tax Code Section so-and-so is hereby declared null and void on the grounds of lack of quorum at the time of adoption. All payments made pursuant to it are subject to refund. The pharmacy building is the unencumbered property of Han Ji-yoon. He pricked his finger with the new needle Ji-yoon had given him the day before. It really hardly hurt at all. A drop of blood fell into the ink. A golden line flashed. Certified. Ji-yoon stood and looked at the golden light. Then she laughed. Quietly, into her fist, as if she had forgotten how to laugh long ago and was remembering how to do it. Dan realized she hadn't laughed in a very long time. She said thank you. Just thank you. No tears and no hugs. Just one word spoken by a person who had clung to a single stubbornness for 10 years and could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The next morning, a cup of hot tea was sitting on Dan's table again, and from that day on, the cup was there every morning. No notes, no explanations, just tea. News of the tax case spread throughout the city within a day. The mayor came to see Bryn that same day. The former mayor. His name was Alden, a fat man with a red face and shifty eyes. He demanded a meeting with the auditor. Dan received him. Alden shouted. He said that Dan had no right to overturn city council decisions, that it was an abuse of power, that he would complain to the guild. Dan listened in silence. When Alden paused to catch his breath, Dan asked him if he knew that Councilman Thorne's signature had been forged. Alden turned pale. He said he didn't know. Dan held out his hand and said that if Alden was willing to repeat that under oath, then he should shake his hand. Alden looked at the outstretched palm, at the golden line that glowed faintly on the back of it. He didn't shake his hand. He turned and walked away. Serafina stood by the door and watched him go. She said that Alden would run to cross. Dan nodded. He knew. It was inevitable. Every step he took brought the confrontation closer, but there was nowhere to retreat. In Manhattan, he'd learned one rule. If you start digging into a case, dig to the bottom, because if you stop halfway, the hole you've dug will be filled in with you. By the end of the second week, there was a line at Bryn's door every morning. 5 people, 10, 15. People came with lease agreements, with IOUs, with employment contracts, with prenuptial agreements. Dan read every document from the first word to the last. He checked each one for a glow. Gold means clean. Red meant a hole. Black meant a forgery. He worked 14 hours a day. Bryn recorded and archived. Serafina stood at the door. Ji-yoon brought tea and ointment for his fingers. It wasn't an office yet. It was an old scribe's room with 2 chairs and 1 table. But people kept coming, and everyone left with a document bearing a gold seal.
Dan sat on the threshold in the evening, drinking Ji-yoon's tea. Serafina was cleaning her sword nearby. Bryn had gone to bed. It was quiet outside. Dan looked at his hand. The golden line glowed evenly. He thought that in Manhattan his office had occupied half a floor of a skyscraper. 30 lawyers, 5 secretaries, an $8,000 coffee machine. Here he had a room with a leaky roof and tea in a clay mug. And for some reason, it was here, for the first time in 12 years, that he felt his work mattered. Toward the end of the 3rd week, Dan found Emily Kane, or rather, she found him. Serafina dragged her in by the collar, literally. Petite, freckled, fingers smeared with ink. Her eyes were red from crying. Serafina said she'd caught her at the back door. The girl had been trying to climb in through a window. Emily stood in front of Dan's desk and stared at the floor. She was 19, but looked 15. Skinny. Her clothes were old and didn't belong to her, clearly borrowed from someone else. Dan asked what she wanted. Emily was silent. Then she pulled a crumpled sheet of paper from her bosom. She placed it on the table, her hands trembling. Dan unfolded the paper. It was a death certificate, or rather, an attempt at one. The text was written in uneven handwriting. The ink was cheap. There was no stamp. Her parents' names were written crookedly. The date of death was approximate. It was a forgery. A poor forgery. A forgery made by someone who didn't know how to forge documents. Dan looked at Emily. She stood there waiting for him to call the guards, or kick her out, or hit her.
She was ready for anything except what happened. Dan asked why she needed a death certificate for her parents. Emily said that without it, she couldn't get orphans' benefits. Without benefits, she had nowhere to live. Without a roof over her head, she would die in the winter. Her parents disappeared when she was 11. They just left one day and never came back. No one knows if they're alive or dead. She has no birth certificate, no record in the city registry, nothing at all. By the laws of this world, she doesn't exist. A person without documents isn't a person. They're a nobody. Dan leaned back in his chair. In Manhattan, he'd seen many different clients. Billionaires who wanted to hide their money. Corporations that wanted to destroy their competitors. Divorcing spouses who wanted to take their children. But he had never seen a person who forged documents because, without them, he literally didn't exist. He took the fake certificate and tore it up. Emily flinched. He told her that forgery was a bad idea, not because it was dishonest, but because a bad forgery would be discovered, and then things would be worse. Emily nodded. She knew that. She had cried while writing that certificate because she couldn't lie, not even on paper. Dan took a blank sheet of paper. He asked Emily for her full name. She said she didn't have a last name. Her parents had never told her. She wasn't listed in the registry. She was just Emily. Dan thought for a moment. Then he asked what last name she wanted. Emily looked at him as if he'd asked what planet she wanted. She said she didn't know. Dan suggested Kane, a simple last name. It sounds good. It's easy to spell. Emily repeated it in a whisper. Emily Kane. One more time. Emily Kane. Dan wrote the document, a certificate of existence. He didn't know if such a document existed in this world, but he was the certifier, and if he said the document existed, then the document existed. This certifies that Emily Kane was born in Havenrest. Age 19.
Status: full-fledged resident of the city. This certificate is certified by the seal of Daniel Archer and has the same legal force as an entry in the city registry. He bit his finger. A drop of blood. A golden flash. Certified. He handed the scroll to Emily. She took it with both hands, pressed it to her chest, and whispered 2 words. I am. Dan poured her tea from Ji-Yun. Emily drank and couldn't stop the tears. They streamed down her freckled cheeks and dripped into the cup, but she didn't notice. Bryn turned away toward the wall. Serafina stood by the door and stared at the ceiling. Even she. When Emily finished her tea, Dan asked if she knew how to write. Emily nodded. She said she did. Not very neatly, but she could. She'd taught herself. From street signs and scraps of paper she found at the market. Dan looked at Bryn. Bryn nodded. Dan told Emily he needed a secretary, someone to keep records.
Greet visitors. Manage the archives. Work every day from morning till night. He'd cover room and board until the office started turning a profit. Then they'd discuss it. He asked if she agreed. Emily looked at him, at Bryn, at Serafina, at the scroll in her hands, on which her name shone in gold letters. She said yes. She said she wouldn't go anywhere. And she didn't leave. Not that day. Not the next. Not a year later. With Emily's arrival, the office's work changed. The girl was quick and attentive. She memorized the names of all the clients. She remembered their cases. She remembered contract numbers. In 3 days, she brought order to the papers that Bryn had been piling up in disarray. She sorted the documents by type: debt, lease, employment, marriage, land. Each type got its own shelf. Each document got a number. Dan watched this and thought that at his old firm he would have paid her a 6-figure salary. Here, he paid her with a bowl of soup and a corner of Bryn's house. And she worked 10 times harder than any of his former assistants. By the end of the 3rd week, Archer's office had become a reality. Not officially. They had no sign, no license, and nothing but their reputation. But reputation in this world was worth more than gold. People knew. If you went to Archer with a contract, you'd come out with the truth. By this time, Dan had certified 32 documents. He'd destroyed 21 usurious contracts. He had freed 14 families from illegal debts. He had returned 3 buildings to their rightful owners. And every day, the golden line on his hand glowed a little brighter. But the silence frightened him more than the noise. The Cross Guild was silent. After that first visit from the 4 guards, no one else had come. No threats, no warnings, no repeat invitations. Silence. Dan knew that silence in business negotiations meant one of 2 things. Either the opponent was preparing a major move, or the opponent had already made a move and you hadn't noticed it. He asked Holt what was going on. Holt didn't know. He said Cross's people were behaving as usual, patrolling, collecting duties, nothing out of the ordinary. Serafina was less optimistic. She said she'd seen 2 strangers at the market. They weren't buying, they were watching. The office, the people coming and going, they were observing. Dan nodded. He said they needed to prepare. He asked Bryn to compile a list of all current guild regulations, all the rules, all the bylaws, everything Cross could use against him. Bryn worked for 2 days. The list came to 12 pages. Dan read it in the evenings by the light of an oil lamp. He was looking for a weapon. Not a sword or a shield. Words, paragraphs, clauses,
Every system has loopholes. He knew that better than anyone. He found 3 of them. First,
According to the Guild's bylaws, any notary with more than 20 certified documents may apply to register an independent office. Dan had 32. Second, registration does not require the Guild's approval, only notification. The Guild may challenge the registration, but only through the courts and only within 30 days. Third, the office continues to operate during the court proceedings. Dan smiled, for the first time in 3 weeks. He told Emily that she needed to write a letter, an official one, addressed to Lord Wayland Cross, head of the Havenrest County Notary Guild. A notification of the registration of Archer's independent notary office. Emily wrote the letter. Her handwriting was neat and clear. She concentrated so hard that the tip of her tongue poked out between her lips. Dan certified the letter. Serafina took it to the Guild building and handed it personally to the clerk on duty. She said the clerk read the first line and turned so pale she thought he would collapse. Dan nodded. Now all that was left was to wait. 30 days. 30 days for Cross to make his move, and Dan was going to make his own move during those 30 days. The next morning, he hung a sign on the door of Bryn's house. He had carved it himself from a piece of wood that a blacksmith had given him as a thank you for resolving a case. The sign had 3 lines. Archer's office. Honest. No exceptions. Emily stood nearby and looked at the sign. Her eyes were shining. She asked why the word expensive wasn't there. Dan looked at her, then at the sign, then back at her, and said they'd add the word expensive when they got a second room. Cross's response arrived on the 9th day after the notice, but not in the form Dan had expected. Not a summons to court, not a formal challenge. A package. A wooden box tied with twine. Emily found it by the door that morning. Serafina wouldn't let her open it. She opened it herself. Inside lay a dead rat with the Guild's wax seal tied to its tail, and a note. 1 word. Leave. Dan looked at the rat. He looked at the seal. He looked at the note. Then he told Emily to register the package as incoming mail under number 34. Emily blinked. Then she took a pen and wrote it down. Incoming number 34. Wooden box. Contents, 1 dead rat and 1 Guild seal. Serafina threw the rat away. Dan kept the seal. Evidence. That same day, the second blow came. Thinner and more dangerous. A cloth merchant named Rojas came to see Dan. He said he wanted to have a contract for the supply of wool from a neighboring barony authenticated. Business as usual. Dan took the document. A golden glow. Clean. Not a single hole, not a single forgery. The contract was flawless. Dan felt a twinge of alarm. In 3.5 weeks, he hadn't seen a single flawless contract. And suddenly, a merchant shows up with a perfect document. He held out his hand for a handshake. Rojas shook it. And Dan got a snapshot. Cold, calculating. Rojas didn't want to certify the contract. Rojas wanted to test how Archer's seal worked, to study it, to memorize the procedure, and to report back to someone. Dan didn't flinch. He smiled and said the contract was in order. The certification would cost 1 silver coin, the standard rate. Rojas paid. Dan certified it. Rojas left. Serafina looked at Dan and asked what was wrong. Dan said that Rojas was a spy. Serafina placed her hand on her sword. Dan shook his head. He said that a spy who left with information was better than a spy who left without information. because a spy without information would return, and a spy with information would tell his master only what he had seen. And he had seen exactly what Dan wanted him to see. Standard procedure: a drop of blood, golden light, nothing special. Serafina looked at him for a long time. Then she said he thought like a man who is used to playing games. Dan replied that for 12 years he had played games where the stakes were higher than a single lawyer's life. On the 12th day, what Dan had been waiting for and fearing happened. Night. Dan was sleeping on his cot in the corner. Serafina was sleeping by the door. Or rather, she wasn't sleeping. She heard them before they reached the house. 3 people. Light footsteps. Professional. She woke Dan with a single touch on his shoulder. He opened his eyes instantly. A habit of light sleep developed over 3 weeks in a foreign world. Serafina held up 3 fingers. Then she pointed to the door. Then to the window. They were coming in from both sides. Dan stood up. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He knew he couldn't fight, but he could do what he was good at: talk. The door swung open. A man in black stood in the doorway, his face covered with a cloth, a short knife in his hand. He stepped inside and was immediately struck in the temple with the hilt of a sword. Serafina moved so fast that Dan saw only the result. The man fell. The second one climbed in through the window. Serafina darted toward him. The blade of the sword stopped an inch from his throat. He froze. The third man was standing outside. He saw that the first was lying unconscious and the second wasn't moving. He ran. Serafina didn't give chase. She was holding the second man. Bryn woke up from the noise. Emily did too. She was standing in the corner, clutching a stack of documents to her chest. Even at the moment of the attack, she had grabbed the files. Dan approached the man on the floor. He was beginning to come to. Dan crouched down beside him and searched him. In his pocket, he found a scroll. A contract for services. The client was not specified, only a seal. A guild seal. The assignment was to eliminate the unregistered certifier Daniel Archer. The payment was 20 gold pieces. Dan read the contract and laughed. Serafina looked at him as if he were crazy. Dan showed her Clause 6. The contractor undertakes not to leave any witnesses. Failure to comply with this condition will result in the payment being voided, and the contractor assumes all consequences. He looked at the assassin. The man looked up at him with an expression of blank incomprehension. Dan explained. The witnesses are alive. 5 people. Dan, Serafina, Bryn, Emily, and the second assassin Serafina is holding. Clause 6 has been violated. The contract is void. There will be no payment. Moreover, all consequences now fall on the assassin. Dan didn't know exactly what the text meant by consequences, but the contract was sealed with the guild seal, which meant it carried weight. The assassin turned pale. He began to speak quickly and incoherently. He said he'd been hired at the tavern by a man with a guild badge. He didn't know his name. He'd received a deposit of 5 gold coins. Dan asked where the deposit was. The assassin pointed to a pouch at his belt. Dan took the pouch. 5 gold coins. Archer's first serious capital. He told the assassin he would let him go, on one condition. The assassin would keep silent about what had happened here. If he spoke, he would violate yet another contract.
and the consequences would come from Archer's seal. The assassin nodded so fast it looked like his head would snap off. Serafina let the second one go. Both disappeared into the night, quickly and quietly. Bryn sat down in a chair and poured himself some water. His hands were shaking. Emily was still clutching the file to her chest. Dan looked at the gold coins in his hand. 5 gold pieces. With that money, they could rent a real place. He said they'd look for an office tomorrow. Serafina said they needed to fix the window first. Dan agreed. Priorities. In the morning, Dan took the assassin's contract to Holt.
Not as a complaint, as evidence. The guild seal on the contract for murder.
Holt looked at the document, and his face turned gray. He said he couldn't arrest Cross, not even with this evidence. The guild was too powerful. It had its own courts and its own laws. Dan nodded. He hadn't expected an arrest. He just needed Holt to know. He needed the sheriff to see what was happening, because sooner or later the moment would come when Holt would have to choose a side, and Dan wanted that choice to be a conscious one. On the 15th day, Dan found a place. An old shop on the corner of the market square. 2 stories, the first for receiving clients, the second for living quarters. The owner sold the building for 3 gold pieces. He was leaving Havenrest. Said there was nothing to breathe in this town. Dan signed the purchase contract. He authenticated it. The golden line flashed. The building was his. The remaining 2 gold pieces went toward furniture. 2 tables, 4 chairs.
Shelves for documents. An inkwell. A supply of parchment. Bryn moved his belongings in a single trip. He didn't have much. Emily scrubbed the floors and windows all day. By evening, the place was sparkling. Serafina inspected all the entrances and exits. She boarded up the back door. The windows on the first floor were fitted with shutters. Dan moved the sign to the new door. Archer's office. Honestly, no exceptions. He stood in the doorway and looked out at the square. People walked by and glanced back. Some pointed, some smiled. A young boy ran up and asked if it was true that a man who burns bad papers lived here. Dan said it was true. The boy ran off to tell his friends. Dan went back inside. On his desk was a cup of tea from Ji-yoon. Next to it lay a note from Emily with tomorrow's schedule. 7 clients. Serafina was standing by the door. Bryn was arranging documents on the shelves. It was an office. His office. For the first time in a month in a strange world, Dan had a place he could call his own. He sat down at the desk. He picked up a pen and began to write. Not a contract, a plan, a strategy for the next 20 days until the challenge period expired. Cross would send killers again, or find another way. He needed to be ready. He needed allies. He needed information. He needed to know the enemy better than the enemy knew itself. The golden line on his arm glowed evenly. It was getting dark outside. 20 days lay ahead, and Dan was going to use every single one of them. On the 18th day, a woman Dan wasn't expecting came to see him. Tall, blonde hair pulled back, her posture was as straight as a ruler, her dress was expensive but old, altered, remade, the dress of someone who was once rich and now pretends to still be rich. She entered the office and stopped at the threshold. She looked around the room. 2 desks, shelves, an inkwell.
Emily at the desk with a quill in her hand.
Serafina by the door. Brenna with the documents. Her gaze settled on Dan. She said her name was Lady Rosalind Vane, Baron Vane's daughter. She said it the way people do who are used to their name alone opening doors, but her voice wavered slightly on the word daughter. Dan offered her a seat. She sat down, back straight, hands folded in her lap, not a single unnecessary movement. Dan asked how he could help. Rosalind was silent for 7 seconds. He counted. In the meeting rooms of Manhattan, he had learned to count pauses. 7 seconds is a long time. It means a person is making a decision that could change their life. Rosalind said she had a contract, a marriage contract, signed by her father when she was 14. The groom, Lord Marcus Thorne, the son of a mine owner in the northern mountains. The Thorne family paid Rosalind's father 80 gold pieces for the bride. The wedding was to take place when Rosalind turned 16, but Rosalind ran away. She hid for 2 years. Then they found her, brought her back. Thorne waited. He was patient. The contract was valid. Rosalind ran away again, and was found again. And so it went 4 times over 13 years. Each time Thorne presented the contract. Each time the law was on his side, because the contract was in order. Her father's signature was there. The guild's seal was there. The terms were clear. Rosalind was a commodity that had been paid for and had to be delivered. Now Thorne had given her a final deadline. 30 days. Then he would come with a bailiff and take her by force. It was legal. To the letter. She placed the contract on the table. Dan picked it up. The glow was strange. Not red, not black. Golden. The contract was clean, legally flawless. Dan read it and felt a cold fury rising inside him. The contract was written perfectly. Every clause, every word. No loopholes, no contradictions, no missing dates. The person who drafted it knew their stuff. Dan read to the end. Then he read it again. And again. He read the contract 3 times and saw the same thing 3 times. A golden glow. Clean. He laid the scroll on the table. Rosalind was watching him. She was waiting. She was waiting for him to say what everyone else had said. The contract is valid. Nothing can be done. The law is the law. Dan didn't say that. He said the contract was clean, but the contract wasn't the only document in the case. Rosalind frowned. Dan asked what state her father had been in when he signed the contract. Rosalind fell silent. Then she said quietly that her father had been drinking. A lot. Every day. From morning till night. He started drinking after Rosalinda's mother died. She was 10 at the time. By the time he was 14, when he signed the prenup, he could no longer climb the stairs on his own. Dan nodded. He asked if there were any medical records, doctor's reports, anything that documented the Baron's health during that period. Rosalinda shook her head. No way. No one kept records on the health of a drunken Baron. Dan turned to Bryn. He asked who had treated Baron Wayne 14 years ago. Bryn thought for a moment. He said that back then the only doctor in the county was old Catherine. She had died, but her records should have been passed on to whoever took over her practice. Dan looked at the door. Then he stood up.
He told Serafina that they were going to the pharmacy. Ji-yoon listened in silence. When Dan finished, she went into the back room. He could hear her moving boxes and rustling papers. 20 minutes later, she returned with a thick, leather-bound notebook. Catherine's records. Ji-yoon had inherited them along with part of the inventory when she opened her pharmacy. She had never read them. There was no reason to. Dan opened the notebook. Tiny handwriting, faded ink. He looked for the name Wayne. Found it on page 37. Baron Arnold Wayne. Visit on such and such a date. Complaints of tremors. Loss of orientation.
Memory lapses. Inability to hold a pen. Diagnosis: severe alcohol use disorder. Recommendation: complete rest and withdrawal from activities. The visit date was 3 months before the prenuptial agreement was signed. Dan closed the notebook. He told Ji-yoon that she would need to testify. As the custodian of her predecessor's medical records, she could confirm the notebook's authenticity. Ji-yoon nodded. They returned to the office. Rosalinda was sitting in the same chair in the same position. Back straight, hands folded. She hadn't moved since they left. Dan placed the notebook in front of her. He pointed to an entry. He explained, her father was legally incompetent at the time the contract was signed. Medical records confirm this. Tremors, memory loss, inability to hold a pen. A person in such a state cannot enter into legally binding agreements. A contract signed by an incapacitated person is void. Indisputable. Void. It doesn't exist. It never existed. Rosalinda looked at the entry in the notebook. Her straight back trembled slightly, just a tiny bit. Dan had written the document, a declaration of the nullity of the marriage contract between Baron Wayne and the Thorne family, based on the signatory's legal incapacity, as confirmed by Dr. Catherine's medical records kept by the pharmacist Han Ji-eun. He had sealed it with blood. A golden line flashed. Rosalinda's contract darkened and crumbled. 13 years. For 13 years she had been running from a paper that didn't exist. Rosalinda stood up. She stood in the middle of the office and didn't move. Her face was motionless, the perfect mask of an aristocrat. But her hands were trembling. She said she didn't know who she was now. For 13 years she had been a fugitive, a bride who refused to be a bride. Now the contract was gone, and she didn't know who she was without that contract. Dan opened a desk drawer. He took out a blank sheet of parchment. He placed it in front of her. He told her to fill it out herself, to write who she is, what she wants, who she intends to be. He would certify it. Rosalind looked at the blank sheet, then at Dan, then back at the sheet. She began to cry, silently, without sobs. Tears simply streamed down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. For the first time in 13 years, she allowed herself to cry. Emily brought her some tea. Bryn turned away. Serafina stood by the door, clenching her jaw. Dan sat and waited. He didn't rush her. In the Manhattan boardrooms, he had learned one more thing. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for a client is simply to give them time. Rosalind came the next day. She brought the completed sheet. She had written briefly, Rosalind Wayne, a single woman, heiress to Wayne Castle, advisor to the Archer firm. Dan read it. He looked at her. He hadn't expected the last point. Rosalind said she needed a job. She knows the aristocracy. She knows etiquette. She knows how to talk to people with titles and money. Dan will need that. Soon. Because after he destroyed Thorne's contract, the Thorne family won't stay silent. And the Thornes aren't the Garways. The Thornes are gold and steel. Dan held out his hand. Rosalind shook it. A snapshot. Cold and bright. Pride, determination, and hope hidden somewhere very deep. He sealed her letter. A golden line flashed. Archer's office received the diploma. On the 22nd day after the notification, Dan realized that Cross would not challenge the registration in court. Cross had chosen a different path. Dan learned this from Holt. The sheriff came in the morning, his face ashen. He said that yesterday the city council had received a petition from the guild, not about Archer. It was about taxes. The guild proposed introducing a new levy, a levy on independent certifiers. 20 gold pieces a month, plus 5 gold pieces for each certification, plus an annual qualification review.
The cost of the review was 50 gold pieces. Dan listened and did the math in his head. His monthly income was barely 10 silver pieces. People paid with whatever they could: bread, cloth, labor, sometimes coins. 20 gold pieces a month was a sum he couldn't pay even if he worked around the clock. Cross wasn't going to kill him. Cross was going to ruin him, legally, to the letter. Dan smirked. He respected that move. In Manhattan, that tactic was called regulatory capture. If you can't beat the competition, change the rules so they can't play. Rosalind sat at her desk and listened. When Holt left, she said the petition would be approved. Cross had a majority on the board. 7 of the 12 board members worked with his guild. 3 owed him money. 1 was a relative of his. Dan nodded. He asked when the vote would be. Rosalind said in 5 days. Dan stood up. He said a lot could be done in 5 days. He asked Bryn to get a list of the council members, all 12. Names,
positions, ties to the guild, the contracts they'd signed, the debts hanging over them. He asked Rosalind to find out which of the counselors hadn't been fully bought off yet, who was wavering, who held a personal grudge against Cross. He asked Serafina to find the 3rd assassin, the one who'd escaped that night, not for revenge, for a conversation. And he asked Ji-yoon to check if there was anything interesting about the council members and old Catherine's records. Everyone got to work. 2 days. Rosalinda returned first. She found 3 counselors who didn't like Cross. One was a blacksmith named Darwin. Cross had cheated him 10 years ago with an iron supply contract. Darwin remembered. The second was the widow of Counselor Thorne, the very same one whose signature had been forged on the tax document in Ji-yoon's case. The widow didn't know about the forgery, but she disliked the guild for personal reasons. The third was Father Matthew, a priest.
The only council member not bound by contracts with the guild, a man of principles. Bryn brought the financial records. They were incomplete, but even incomplete, they painted a picture. The guild paid the counselors, not directly, through intermediaries, through discounts on certification, through preferential loans, through lucrative contracts for their relatives. A bribery system constructed so meticulously that formally no law was broken. Dan recognized this scheme. He'd seen similar ones in Manhattan, different scales, same principles. Serafina found the third killer. His name was Court. He was hiding in a village across the river. Serafina didn't beat him. She brought him to the office. Court was trembling. He thought they were going to kill him. Dan offered him a seat. He poured some tea. Court sat there, not understanding what was happening. Dan explained. He didn't want to punish him. He wanted information. Who had hired him? What the man with the guild badge looked like.
Where the meeting took place. Court told him everything. He had been hired by a man named Stephen Hall, Cross's right-hand man. The meeting was in the back room of a tavern on Mill Street. Hall gave him a deposit and a contract. He said the job was simple. One man, no security, no weapons. Court didn't know Dan had Serafina. Dan wrote it all down. Name, place, circumstances. He verified Court's testimony. Court signed with a trembling hand. The golden line flashed. Now it was a document. Not rumors, not suspicions. A document bearing Archer's seal. Dan let Court go. He left so quickly he tripped over the threshold. There were 3 days left until the vote. Dan went to see the blacksmith, Darwin. The conversation was brief. Dan told him about the new tax. He explained that if it passed, any independent craftsman in the city would be the next target. Today, a tax on notaries. Tomorrow, a tax on blacksmiths who aren't in the guild. The day after tomorrow, on bakers, on laundresses, On everyone who works for themselves. Darwin listened, and his face darkened. He said he would vote against it. Widow Thorne was more difficult. Rosalind went to see her herself. She knew how to talk to aristocratic widows. She told her about the forgery of her late husband's signature on the tax assessment. She showed her the evidence. The widow turned pale. Then she blushed. Then she said she would vote against anything the guild proposed. For the rest of her days. Father Matthew needed no convincing. He came to Dan himself. He said he'd heard about the new tax and considered it unfair. He asked Dan what he planned to do. Dan said he planned to speak at the council meeting. Father Matthew nodded. He said he'd support him. 3 votes, against 7. Not enough. Dan sat at the table that evening, staring at the numbers. 3 votes out of 12. He needed to flip 4 more in 2 days. Rosalind sat down across from him. She said it was impossible to flip 4. They were too loyal to cross. Dan looked at her. He said he wasn't going to flip them. He was going to make sure the vote didn't happen. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. A quorum was needed to pass the new tax. 9 out of 12. If 3 counselors didn't show up for the meeting, there would be no quorum. No decision could be made. Rosalind understood. She asked which 3 counselors he planned to convince not to come. Dan said none. He already had 3 votes. Darwin, Thorne's widow, Father Matthew. If they came and voted against it, that would be 3 votes. But if they didn't come at all, there would be no quorum, and the vote would be postponed. And if it was postponed, the guild would have to submit a new petition, a new procedure, new deadlines, another 30 days. Rosalinda looked at him. Then she smiled slowly. For the first time in all the time he'd known her, she said it was a dirty trick. Dan replied that it was a procedural move. In Manhattan, it was called a filibuster, and it worked at the highest level. On the day of the meeting, 3 chairs in the council chamber remained empty. Darwin had gone hunting. Thorne's widow was bedridden with a headache. Father Matthew had gone to a neighboring village to baptize a baby. The council chairman counted those present. 9. 8. He counted again. 8. 1 was missing.
It turned out to be the ninth counselor, an old merchant named Graham. He hadn't come either. Dan hadn't asked him to. Graham had simply fallen ill. For real. There was no quorum. The vote was postponed. Cross sat on the guest balcony and looked at the empty chairs. Dan stood by the wall and looked at Cross. Their eyes met. Cross was a tall, gray-haired man in an immaculate black doublet, a pince-nez on a thin chain, soft hands, a calm face, the face of a man accustomed to winning. He looked at Dan for a long time, without malice, without irritation, with interest. Like a scientist examining a new species of insect. Then he stood up and left. Dan walked out of the council chamber. Serafina was waiting on the street. She asked what would happen next. Dan said they had won 30 days. Cross would resubmit the petition, but in those 30 days, Dan intended to make himself so indispensable to this city that no council would vote to expel him. Serafina said it was an ambitious plan. Dan replied that ambition was a professional disease, incurable. 30 days flew by like 10. Dan worked. From morning until late at night, every day, no days off. Archer's office took in 20 clients a day. Emily managed the queue. Bryn filed the documents. Serafina stood by the door. Rosalind greeted those clients who arrived with titles and demanded special treatment. She explained to them that Archer, the notary, did not grant special treatment. There was a queue. One client after another. A baron after a peasant. A merchant after a widow. Some left indignant. Most stayed, because there was nowhere else to go. By the end of the second month, Dan had certified over 100 documents. He had destroyed 43 indentured contracts, returned 11 buildings to their rightful owners, freed 26 families from illegal debts. The number was important, not for statistics, to understand the scale. 100 documents meant 100 families who are now connected to his office. 100 families who know that Archer is a man who keeps his word. On the 30th day, something happened that kept Dan awake for the next 3 nights. An old man came to him, frail, thin. His clothes were patched. He stood at the end of a line that stretched halfway across the square that day. Ahead of him stood merchants, barons, even an ambassador from a neighboring district. The old man stood last and didn't complain. By the time his turn came, it was already evening. Emily wanted to say that the reception was over. Dan looked at the old man and told her to let him in. The old man's name was Orrin. He was a farmer. He had lived his whole life in the village of Lakeview, a 3-hour walk from Havenrest. He had a house, a small one, 1 room, land all around, a vegetable garden, 2 trees. That was all he had. And now his neighbor was saying the land was his. The neighbor had put up a fence through Orrin's garden. Orrin went to the village headman. The headman said the neighbor had a deed. Orrin had no deed, so the land belonged to the neighbor. Orrin said his grandfather had built that house. His father had lived in that house. He himself had been born in that house. 74 years. But he had no papers. And so, by law, the house wasn't his. The land wasn't his. Nothing was his. Dan listened. He looked at Orrin's hands. Huge, cracked. The hands of a man who had worked the land for 70 years. Dan stood up. He told Emily to write in the logbook that client appointments for tomorrow would start 2 hours later. Emily nodded. She already understood. Dan took off his jacket. He turned to Serafina and said they were leaving. Serafina asked where. Dan said to the village of Lakeview. A 3-hour walk. Serafina looked at him, at his boots, which were already falling apart, at his face pale from lack of sleep. Then she nodded and adjusted the sword on her belt. They walked for 3 hours. Orrin walked ahead and showed the way. For a 74-year-old man, he moved surprisingly fast. Dan could barely keep up. Serafina walked beside him and didn't complain. The village of Lakeview turned out to be a dozen houses by a small lake. Orrin's house stood on a hill. Old. Stone foundation, wooden walls, a thatched roof, a vegetable garden nearby. Half the garden was fenced off by a rough wooden fence. Dan examined the boundary stones. 4 stones dug into the ground, old, overgrown with moss.
A symbol was carved into each one, a cross with a circle. Dan asked Orrin what the symbol meant. Orrin said it was his grandfather's mark. That's how they marked land in the old days, before papers, before contracts, before guilds. A stone in the ground meant more than a scroll in one's hand. Dan nodded. He spoke with the neighbors. 4 of them confirmed that the house and land had belonged to Orrin's family for as long as they could remember. One old man said he remembered Orrin's grandfather. He remembered how he had set the boundary stones. Dan took out a parchment and began to draw a map. Freehand. He wasn't an artist, but he was a lawyer who had spent 12 years working on land disputes. He knew how to read the plot boundaries. 4 boundary stones, the distances between them, reference points, the lake, the hill, the old oak tree. He recorded the neighbors' statements, each signed as best they could, with a cross or a fingerprint. By nightfall, they returned to Haven Rest. Dan didn't go to sleep. He sat down at the table and wrote a document, a deed of ownership, based on the boundary markers set by the current owner's grandfather, based on the testimony of 4 residents of Lakeview, based on the Orrin family's continuous residence for 3 generations. Plot number such and such in the village of Lakeview belongs to Orrin. He sealed it with his blood. A golden line flashed. In the morning, Orrin received his document. The old man stood in the middle of the office, holding the scroll with both hands. He couldn't speak. Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks and disappeared into his gray beard. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Dan silently poured him some tea. They sat and drank tea. 2 men, one of whom had lived in this world for 74 years, the other 2 months. Orrin left. Dan stood in the doorway and watched him go. The old man's small figure walked slowly across the square. In his hand, he carried the scroll as if it were a treasure. There was a line in the square: merchants, barons, the ambassador. They had stood there for half a day, waiting while Dan went to the village to see the peasant. No one had left. Not a single person. Dan looked at the line. The line looked at him. He saw something new in their eyes. Not fear, not curiosity. Respect. He returned to the table. There was tea on the table. The next day, 3 times as many people came to the office, and among them were those who had previously thought the law didn't apply to them. Peasants, fishermen, day laborers, people with no name and no papers. They came and said they'd heard about the old man, about the man who'd dropped everything and walked 3 hours to help someone who didn't have a penny to his name. They asked if it was true. Emily replied that it was true.
She said it with such a look on her face that it was impossible to doubt her. Dan was just doing his job.
He didn't think he'd done anything special. He had simply done his job. The old man had come with a problem. The problem had been solved. Period. But the city thought otherwise. The city remembered. And without realizing it, Dan had crossed a line. He was no longer an outsider with a golden seal. He had become a man of haven rest, one of their own. At the end of the 3rd month, Cross struck a real blow. Not through the council, not through assassins, through the law. Dan received the document that morning. Emily accepted it from a courier in guild uniform. An official notice. Lord Wayland Cross summons Daniel Archer to the guild court on charges of 34 violations of the notarial code. Dan read the list of charges. Illegal certification of documents without a guild license, destruction of valid contracts without the consent of the parties, undermining the authority of the guild, assuming the title of scribe, and so on. 34 counts, each one written flawlessly. Each one citing a specific paragraph of the code. Each one backed up by a date and a description of the incident. Cross had been working on this document for more than a week. Dan set the notice aside and looked at the team. Everyone was there. Serafina by the door, Emily at the table, Bryn by the shelves, Rosalind in her corner, and Ji-yoon, who had just brought in the morning tea. Dan said they were being summoned to court. Emily turned pale. Bryn sat down in a chair. Serafina's expression didn't change. Rosalind took the document and read it. She said the trial was scheduled for 10 days from now, in the guild's great hall. 100 of the continent's most senior notaries would serve as judges. Representatives of the Garen Conclave and the Talasian League would be on the balcony. An international audience. Cross was turning the trial into a spectacle. Dan nodded. He knew. In Manhattan, such trials were called show trials, a public execution masquerading as justice. Cross wanted to destroy him in front of witnesses, so that no one on the continent would dare repeat what Dan had done. Rosalind asked what he was going to do. Dan said he needed a copy of the Central Registry, the complete one, for the last 100 years. All the statutes, all the amendments, all the crossed-out lines. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. She said the Central Registry was kept in the Guild's archives. Access was restricted to Guild members only. Dan looked at Bryn. Bryn had once been a Guild member. He'd been expelled, but expulsion doesn't mean his name has been erased from the registry. Bryn shook his head. He said his name had been erased. He had been formally and publicly stripped of his status. He had no access. Dan thought for a moment. Then he turned to Rosalind. He asked if there were copies of the registry outside the Guild. Rosalind said that by law, 1 copy was kept in the city archives, but the city archives were controlled by the mayor. And the mayor was Olden. Who fears Cross more than his own shadow? Dan stood up. He said he was going to see Alden. Serafina went with him. Rosalinda did too. Alden received them in his office, a small room cluttered with papers. Alden sat at his desk, sweating. He was sweating profusely and constantly. His forehead glistened. His hands left wet marks on the parchment. Dan sat down across from him. He said he needed access to the city archives, to the Central Registry. Alden began to say that it was impossible, that council approval was required, that the archives were closed for inventory, that the key was lost. Dan listened in silence. When Alden finished, Dan took the certified testimony of court out of the folder. He placed it on the desk.
He said he had a document bearing Archer's seal, the mercenary's testimony that Stephen Hall, Cross's right-hand man, had ordered the murder of an independent certifier, the guild seal on the contract for the murder. Alden turned pale.
Dan said he wasn't threatening him, he was simply informing him. The mayor is obligated to know that crimes involving guild seals are being committed within his jurisdiction, and the mayor is obligated to assist with the investigation, including by providing access to the city archives. Alden looked at the document, then at Dan, then at Serafina, who was standing by the door, then at Rosalind, who was sitting with the expression of someone who knows exactly where all the skeletons are in this closet. Alden opened a desk drawer. He took out a key. He placed it on the table. Dan took the key. He said thank you and left. The archives were located in the basement of City Hall, a damp stone hall with wooden shelves, dust, mold, the smell of old paper. The central registry took up 3 shelves, thick, leather-bound volumes. Dan carried them to the office 4 at a time. Emily helped. Serafina carried 6. By evening, all the volumes were in the office. Dan began to read. He read for 5 days. From morning until 3 in the morning. Ji-yoon brought him herbal teas for his headache. Emily brought food, which he forgot to eat. Serafina brought candles when the old ones burned out. Rosalinda sat nearby and helped him search. She knew the numbering system. She knew the structure of the registry. Without her, he would have searched for a month. On the 3rd day, he found the first lead. On the 4th, he confirmed it. By the 5th day, he had the full picture. The charges against Cross were based on 34 counts. The main one cited the Guild's code on impostors, a paragraph granting the Guild the right to revoke the certification of anyone working without a license. Dan found that paragraph in the registry, number 412 and 8. He read it, and read it again, and began to laugh. Rosalind looked at him with concern. Dan showed her the page. Statute number 412 and 8, the provision regarding holidays, not impostors. About holidays. There was no statute on impostors. Dan flipped back through the pages. He found a footnote. The statute on impostors had been struck down 80 years ago, during the reform of the registration system. It had been replaced by the statute on free practice, which, as it happened, allowed one to work without a guild license, provided one had 20 certified documents. Cross was citing a document that hadn't existed for 80 years. Either he didn't know, or he was counting on no one checking. Dan closed the volume. He looked at Rosalind. She was smiling, for the 2nd time. He looked at Bryn. The old man was sitting with his mouth open. He looked at Emily. She didn't understand what was happening, but saw that everyone was smiling, so she smiled too. He looked at Serafina. Serafina wasn't smiling. She asked what it meant. Dan explained. It meant that Cross, in front of 100 notaries, would cite a non-existent document, and Dan would catch him in the act. In public. In front of witnesses. In front of representatives of the conclave and the League. And citing a non-existent document in court is, according to Statute 411.2, intentional falsification of a legal basis. The penalty is revocation of the seal for life. Serafina looked at him for a long time. Then she said he was going to destroy Cross with his own weapon. Dan shook his head. He said he wasn't going to destroy Cross. He was going to let Cross destroy himself. The night before the trial, Dan didn't sleep. He sat at the table and reread his notes.
One folder. Inside was a certified copy of a page from the Central Registry, Statute 412, Section 8, the provision on holidays. And next to it, Statute 411, Section 2, on forgery, with the section on penalties highlighted. Emily walked over and set a mug of tea on the table. She asked if he was afraid. Dan thought for a moment. He said no. He said he'd been afraid only once in his life,
when he was lying on the asphalt and saw the blood draining from him. Since then, nothing in the world seemed scary enough to him. Emily nodded. She didn't understand the part about the asphalt, but she understood that he wasn't afraid, and that was enough. The Grand Hall of the Notaries Guild was located in the county capital, a 2-hour ride from Haven Rest. A stone building with columns, high ceilings, stained glass windows depicting feathers and scales, symbols of justice that had long since become symbols of power here. Dan entered alone, without a sword, without an entourage, carrying only a single folder. Serafina wanted to go with him. He said no. Rosalinda wanted to go with him. He said no. Emily wanted to go with him. He said no. He explained, "This is a court, not a battle. In court, the one with the most people behind him doesn't win. The one with the better arguments wins. And also, the one who looks calmer." A single man with a folder looks calmer than a man with an armed entourage. He entered the hall. 100 chairs in a semicircle. A notary sat in each one. Old, young, gray-haired, bald, fat, thin, all in black robes. Each wore a guild seal on a chain around their neck. 100 seals. 100 certifiers. 100 people who made their living with words. Observers sat in the gallery. To the right, the delegation from the Northern Conclave of Garin, 3 men in blue cloaks with silver embroidery. To the left, representatives of the Talasian League, 2 in white, a woman and a man. Mercenaries stood by the doors. 8 men, leather armor, short swords, crosses men. They were supposed to arrest Dan if he tried to leave. Dan walked across the hall. His footsteps echoed off the stone walls. He stopped in the center, in front of the dais where the lectern stood. Behind the lectern stood Wayland Cross, gray-haired, upright, a pince-nez on a thin chain, a gentle smile. Hands folded in front of him. He looked like a professor before a lecture. Cross began. His voice was soft and confident, the voice of a man who had spoken in this hall hundreds of times and won every time. He laid out the charges, 34 counts, each one polished, each one sounded convincing. Illegal representation, breach of existing contracts, misappropriation of a title, undermining of authority. He spoke for 20 minutes, without pauses, without stuttering. The perfect speech of the perfect prosecutor. The courtroom listened in silence. When Cross finished, he turned to Dan and asked what the defendant had to say in his defense. Dan stood up. He looked out at the courtroom. 100 faces, 100 pairs of eyes. Some looked on with curiosity, some with contempt, some with pity. He opened his mouth and said he would not respond to 34 counts. He would respond to 1. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Cross tilted his head slightly. Dan said that in the 17th count of the indictment, Lord Cross referred to the Guild's Code on Impostors. He asked Cross under what number this statute was registered in the Central Registry. Cross answered without a pause. 412.8. His voice was steady. confident. Dan nodded. He thanked him. Then he opened the folder. He said he had a certified copy of the Central Registry, Statute 412.8. He held up the document so the entire room could see it. He said that Statute 412.8 was the provision on holidays. Silence. Absolute. Dan continued. He said that the statute on impostors did not exist. It had been struck down 80 years ago during the reform of the registration system. It had been replaced by the statute on free practice, which permits work without a guild license provided one has 20 certified documents. At the time of filing the notice, Dan had 32. Cross stood behind the lectern. His expression hadn't changed. Only his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the lectern. He said that it was, of course, a typo. He meant a different number. Dan shook his head. He said it wasn't a typo. Lord Cross had just, in the presence of 100 witnesses, cited a non-existent document. He had named a specific number, 412 8/10. He didn't say the number was approximate. He didn't say he might be mistaken. He stated it with absolute certainty. Dan lowered his voice, almost to a whisper. The room fell even quieter. He said that according to the statute that actually exists, 411 2/10, referring to a non-existent document in a court hearing, constitutes intentional falsification of judicial grounds. The penalty is revocation of the seal for life. And further, under Clause B of the same code, a witness present at the offense has the right to record it on the spot. He took out a pen, bit his finger. A drop of blood fell onto the blank sheet, and he wrote right in the air. Golden letters hung before the hall. Lord Wayland Cross is stripped of his right to certify from this day forward and forever. Grounds: falsification of judicial grounds in the presence of 100 witnesses. Certified by Daniel Archer. The golden line on his hand flared up, brightly. So brightly that the light reflected off the walls and windows, and the entire hall turned golden for a moment. The seal on Cross's chest, old, heavy, on a silver chain. It turned black, cracked, turned to ash. The chain fell onto the pulpit with a soft clink. Cross clutched his throat. Not from pain, from emptiness. 40 years of his life had just turned to ash on the wooden pulpit. The hall stood still. 100 notaries sat and watched. No one was breathing. The mercenaries at the door exchanged glances, their contract with Cross, their pay, their orders. All of it hinged on the seal of a man who had just ceased to exist as a certifier. Dan closed the folder. He surveyed the room. 100 faces. Some were white, some were gray, some were red. He began to speak, calmly, as if at a business meeting. He said he hadn't come to fight the guild. He had come to propose a reform. In a week, he would submit a draft. New rules. Simple. Clear. Protecting the weaker party. He asked everyone to read them carefully, especially the clauses on protecting debtors, on prohibiting exploitative terms, on the right to renegotiate a contract if circumstances changed. He said goodnight, turned around and walked toward the exit. The mercenaries at the door parted, not because they were afraid, because they didn't know what to do. And the orders lay in ashes on the lectern, along with Cross's seal.
Dan stepped out onto the street. Night, cold air, stars. Foreign stars that had become almost familiar over the past 3 months.
They were waiting for him on the steps. Serafina stood with her arms crossed. Her face was stony. Her eyes were watchful. Ji-yoon held a lantern in one hand and a cloak in the other. She held out the cloak without a word. Emily stood with a mug of hot tea. Steam rose into the night air. Rosalinda sat in a carriage she'd borrowed from a merchant she knew. The door was open. She said that the Elven Embassy had sent a request for an audience. Dan looked at her and thought that the elves would have to wait. He took the mug from Emily. He took a sip. Ji-yoon's tea. Bitter. With mint. Hot. He said quietly that they had a lot of work to do tomorrow. The carriage set off. Serafina rode alongside on a horse she'd managed to find somewhere. Ji-yoon sat in the carriage across from Dan and silently stared at the golden line on his arm. Emily fell asleep on Rosalinda's shoulder 10 minutes later. She was tired of waiting. Dan looked out the carriage window. In the east, a faint streak of dawn was visible. The golden line on his arm glowed evenly and calmly, like a lamp in the window of a house you want to return to. After Cross's fall, the city changed in a single week. Cross's men vanished from the streets. The tax collectors stopped knocking on doors. Mercenaries with guild badges left Havenrest so quietly it was as if they had never been there. Stephen Hall, Cross's right-hand man, fled the day after the trial. He was seen on the road heading north, alone, without belongings, without a seal, without a future. The city council convened 3 days later. This time, all 12 members were present, a full quorum. They voted unanimously. Daniel Archer was recognized as Havenrest's supreme certifier. A new position, a new status. Holt delivered the council's decision to him personally. He stood in the doorway of the office and, for the first time in 20 years, smiled without shame. Dan accepted the document, read it, certified it. He hung it on the wall next to the plaque. But there was no time to rejoice. 2 days after the council's decision, a letter arrived from Baron Torvald. The very same Baron across the river. Holt had spoken of him on the first day. Torvald controlled the lands east of Havenrest, 3 villages, a bridge across the river, and the only road connecting the city to the southern trade routes. The letter was polite, impeccably polite. Baron Torvald expressed concern that changes were taking place in Havenrest that disrupted the traditional order. He reminded them that the city of Havenrest owed a debt to the barony of Torvald, a debt of 400 gold pieces, signed 10 years ago under the previous mayor. The repayment deadline had expired 5 years ago. The Baron had been patient, but patience has its limits. Attached to the letter was a copy of the debt contract. Dan read the contract. The glow was mixed, gold and red. The contract was genuine. The signatures were there. The seals were there. The debt was real. 400 gold pieces, a sum that could crush a small town. But the red glow burned in one place, the clause about the collateral. In the event of default, the collateral is Havenrest's municipal property, all buildings, all land, all workshops, the entire city. Dan called for Rosalind. She read the contract. Her face hardened. She said she knew this scheme, a predatory loan. A small town is given money it cannot repay. Then they wait. Then they take everything. Dan asked what the town had spent the 400 gold pieces on. Rosalind didn't know. Bryn didn't know.
Holt didn't know. Alden knew, but didn't want to say. Dan went to see him. Alden was sitting in his office, sweating even more than usual. Dan asked directly, "Where did the 400 gold pieces go?" Alden was silent. Then he said the money went toward repairing the bridge. Dan asked which bridge. Alden said the bridge across the river. That very one. The only one.
Dan asked how much it cost to repair the bridge. Alden said 80 gold pieces. Dan looked at him. 400 gold pieces for a repair that costs 80. Where did the remaining 320 go? Alden covered his face with his hands. He said that 320 gold pieces went to Lord Cross for certifying the debt contract. Dan sat down. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he understood. Cross received 320 gold pieces for drawing up a usurious contract that put the entire city up as collateral. The mayor got the bridge. Cross got the gold. Torvald got the right to take the city. Everyone is happy except the residents. A classic scheme. Dan returned to the office. He gathered everyone: Serafina, Rosalind, Bryn, Emily, Ji-yoon. He explained the situation. The debt is real. The contract is valid. The clause about the pledge is exploitative, but technically doesn't violate any laws. He can't annul this contract with a single stroke of the pen. Not this time. Because the contract is sealed with Cross's old seal. And Cross's seal was valid at the time of certification. The revocation of the seal is not retroactive. Rosalinda asked what to do. Dan said they needed to find another way, not by destroying the contract, by fulfilling it. Rosalinda raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. Torvald wants to take the city because the city can't pay, so they need to pay. 400 gold pieces. Serafina said that the city treasury held 30 silver coins and a sack of wheat. Dan nodded. He knew. That was why he had no intention of paying with money. He asked Rosalinde if she knew the history of the relationship between Torvald and the conclave of Garin. Rosalinde knew. The conclave was expanding southward. It was buying up small baronies. Torvald was next on the list. The conclave had offered him a vassal treaty. Torvald had refused. But his position was weakening with every passing year. Dan smiled. He said he had an idea, a crazy one, but in Manhattan he had brokered a deal between two companies that had been in litigation for 8 years. The key turned out to be a third party that both sides needed. Havenrest could be that third party. For 3 days, Dan wrote, not a contract, a proposal, a peace treaty between the city of Havenrest and the barony of Torvald. The gist was simple. Havenrest couldn't pay 400 gold pieces, but Havenrest could offer Torvald something more valuable than gold. Protection. Legal protection. Archer's office would certify all of Torvald's contracts, every trade agreement, every vassal pact, every agreement with the conclave. Archer's seal is unbreakable. No contract certified by Archer can be breached without consequences. For Torvald, this meant the conclave would not be able to deceive him at the signing. It would not be able to slip on oppressive terms. They cannot take his lands through a cunning contract. Archer's seal becomes Torvald's shield. In exchange for what? In exchange for debt forgiveness. 400 gold pieces. In exchange for priceless legal protection for 20 years. Rosalinda read the proposal and said it was either genius or suicidal. Dan replied that in his experience, those two options usually went hand in hand. He sent the proposal to Torvald by courier and waited. The reply came 4 days later. Torvald invited Archer, the guarantor, to a meeting on the bridge over the river, neutral territory. Dan went, this time not alone. Serafina walked on his left, Rosalinda on his right. These were negotiations, not a trial. In negotiations, it's important to show that you have people backing you up. Torvald turned out to be a short, stocky man with a short beard and watchful eyes. He came with 2 soldiers. He stood on his side of the bridge. Dan stopped in the middle. Torvald walked over to him. They stood on the bridge over the river. The wind ruffled the hems of their cloaks. Torvald said he had read the proposal and that it was the most brazen document he had ever seen in his life. Dan replied that brazenness was merely confidence they hadn't expected. Torvald almost smiled. Then he asked why he should believe that Archer's seal was truly unbreakable. Dan held out his hand. Torvald hesitated. Then he shook it. A handshake. Firm, pragmatic, but honest. Torvald didn't want to deceive. Torvald wanted to survive. The conclave was pressuring him. Pirate counter-contracts from the south were undermining his trade. He needed someone he could trust in a world where trust was worth more than gold. Dan said he was ready to prove it. Right here, right now. Let Torvald name any of his current contracts, any one. Dan would read it and point out all the loopholes. For free. Torvald looked at him. Then he pulled a scroll out of his bag. A vassal treaty with the Clav, the very one he had refused to sign. Dan took the scroll. A red glow flooded the parchment like blood. He read for 5 minutes. Then he looked up. He said that this treaty contained 17 hidden clauses that Torvald had overlooked. Clause 4 allows the conclave to send troops into the Baron's territory to protect its interests without defining the word interests. Clause 9 transfers the right to the conclave's underground resources, though this is hidden in the wording about joint management. Clause 14 makes Torvald's heirs automatic vassals with no right to refuse. Torvald listened, and his face changed. Each clause was a blow. He had held on to this scroll for months. His advisors had read it dozens of times. No one had seen what Dan saw in 5 minutes. When Dan finished, Torvald was silent for a full minute. Then he said the debt was forgiven. Dan took out the contract. Torvald signed it. Dan sealed it with his blood. The golden line flashed. The debt of 400 gold pieces ceased to exist. The bridge, the wind, the river below. Torvald held out his hand to Dan once more, not for a photo, for a handshake, a human one. He said that for the first time in 10 years, he felt he had an ally. Dan shook his hand. He said that Torvald didn't have an ally. Torvald had a lawyer. That was better. For the next 6 months, Dan built, not walls, not towers, a system. Archer's office moved into a larger building, the former residence of the Cross Guild. The city council had unanimously handed it over to Dan. 2 floors, 6 rooms, an archive, a reception area, offices, a meeting room. Emily arranged the furniture in 2 days. She directed 3 carpenters and 2 cleaners with the confidence of someone born to lead. Bryn got a separate office for the archive. He sat among his shelves and documents and looked as if he'd landed in paradise. Serafina took the room by the entrance. She hired 2 former guards for security. She vetted them personally. She made them run around the courtyard with wooden swords until both had learned to stand properly. Rosalinda furnished the reception area. A rug on the floor, chairs with cushions, a small table with tea for those waiting. She said that first impressions determine everything. If a client sits in a comfortable chair, he'll speak more honestly than if he's standing in the hallway. Dan didn't argue. In Manhattan, his firm's lobby cost $200,000. Rosalinda achieved the same effect with a rug and 5 cushions. Ji-yoon got a contract to supply medicines for the office, not charity, a contract, with specified quantities, deadlines, and a fair price. She signed it without a word and has been coming every day ever since. Not just with tea, with ointments for his fingers, with herbal remedies for fatigue, with powders for headaches. Sometimes she stayed in the evening, and she and Dan would sit in his office and drink tea. In silence.
2 people who didn't need words to understand each other. 3 months after the trial, emissaries from 2 neighboring towns came to see Dan, Mersfield and Tarnwood. Small towns suffocating under the same debts and the same exploitative contracts as Havenrest. They had heard about what had happened. They wanted the same thing. Dan received them. He listened. He studied their contracts. He traveled to each town in person. He spent 3 days in each. He found loopholes. He eliminated the exploitative terms. He drew up new agreements. 6 months later, the 3 towns were operating under a single set of rules. Archer's Register. A simple code. 23 points. Each one understandable to any peasant. A ban on exploitative terms. Mandatory specification of a specific amount in debt contracts. The right to renegotiation in the event of changed circumstances. A ban on handing over children to settle debts. Minimum notice period for termination. Definition of force majeure.
Dan wrote every point himself, checked every word, sealed it with his blood. 23 points that changed the lives of 3 cities, then 4, then 5. By the end of 6 months, 7 cities were living by Archer's Register. Rumors spread faster than Dan could keep up with them. Emily corresponded with 12 cities at once. Her handwriting became flawless. She was no longer a freckled girl with ink-stained fingers. She was the secretary to the supreme certifier. She wore clean clothes and new boots, and the scroll with her certificate always lay in her breast pocket. In the 4th month, Mira Solvig arrived. She was unlike any person Dan had met in this world. Short, dark skin, silver hair down to her shoulders, slightly pointed ears, a half-elf. She came in silently, sat down in the reception area, waited 4 hours. When Emily asked what was the matter, she said she needed to speak with a verifier about a matter of international law. Emily led her into the office. Mira sat down across from Dan and spoke in a quiet voice. She said she was a translator, a linguist, a specialist in ancient languages. She knows 14 languages, including 3 dead ones. She worked in the Elven archives translating old treaties, and she found something. Dan asked what. Mira took a small notebook out of her bag. She said that in one of the ancient treaties between humans and elves, she had discovered a reference to a document that didn't exist in any archive in the world. A reference to the Great Treaty. Dan didn't know what the Great Treaty was. Mira explained. The Great Treaty is the foundation, an agreement between the gods, humans, and the other world upon which reality itself stands. Concluded at the dawn of time. No one has seen its text. No one knows its terms. But everyone knows it exists. Because the world exists. Dan listened and felt a chill run down his spine. Not from fear,
from recognition.
It was like the moment when you're studying a client's corporate structure and suddenly realize that behind 100 subsidiaries stands a single parent company. And if that parent company collapses, everything collapses. Mira said she needed help. She wants to find the text of the Great Treaty, but to do that, she needs access to the Elven archives, and she doesn't have access. Because, according to Elven law, she doesn't exist. Dan raised an eyebrow. It was the second time in 6 months he'd heard those words, doesn't exist. Mira explained. Her Elven mother had broken an ancient contract with her clan by giving birth to a daughter by a human. According to the code of the High Forest, Mira legally does not exist. She has no right to inherit, to own, to vote. Dan asked her to show him the code. Mira produced a copy, a thin scroll in Elvish. She translated it. Dan listened, his eyes narrowing. The code referred to a procedure established 900 years ago. Dan asked if that procedure was correct. Mira looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and admiration. She said she had been studying this issue for 3 years. The code had been adopted by a council of 12 elders, but one of the elders had been appointed, not elected, which violated the rules. Dan nodded. He knew this story, not the specific one, the general. Great laws that stand for centuries and crumble from a single procedural error. He certified Mira's certificate, in 2 languages, human and Elvish. Mira translated the text herself. The golden line flashed. Dan said that Mira now existed, legally and in fact, and that if the elves wanted to challenge this, he would be happy to meet with their embassy. The elves challenged it. 2 weeks later, an embassy of 3 tall elves in white robes. They entered the office and stopped. They weren't used to human furniture. Rosalinda offered them tea. They declined. Dan received them in the conference room. Mira sat beside him and translated. The elves were polite and unyielding. The High Forest Code is sacred. 900 years. It cannot be challenged. Dan listened. Then he took out a copy of the code. He asked what procedure had been followed in adopting the code. The elves exchanged glances. The elder replied that it had been done according to the procedure of the Council of 12. Dan asked if all 12 had been elected. A pause. The elder elf said that this was an internal matter of the clan. Dan nodded. He said that if it was an internal clan matter, then the clan should have no claims against an external verifier. But if the clan makes claims against an external verifier based on the code, then the code ceases to be an internal matter, and it is subject to verification for procedural correctness. The elves were silent. Dan presented the evidence. One of the 12 had been appointed, not elected. The fact was documented in the elves' own chronicles. Mira found it. Mira translated it. A code adopted in violation of procedure is null and void. The elves looked at him for a long time. The elder said that this man was dangerous, not as a threat, as a matter of observation. They left, silently, without arguing. Mira sat at the table and looked at the scroll with the bilingual testimony. She looked up at Dan. She said her full name aloud. Mira Solvig. For the first time in her life. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. Sister Cordelia Lane came to the office on a rainy day. She stood in the doorway, wet and calm. Tall, with short hair, the calm eyes of someone who had seen too much. She said she didn't need a contract.
She needed someone who could read what had been crossed out. Dan invited her in. Cordelia sat down and told her story. She had been a priestess of the Order of the Great Covenant for 20 years. The order kept sacred texts, books that, according to legend, contained fragments of the Great Covenant.
No one had ever seen the complete text, but the fragments existed. They were copied, studied, interpreted. 10 years ago, Cordelia noticed that there were crossed-out lines in one of the books, not erased, struck through, on purpose. Someone had crossed out an entire paragraph in black ink. Another phrase was written over the ink. Cordelia asked the elders why the paragraph had been crossed out. They told her it was none of her business. She asked what was written in the crossed-out text. She was told that Section 7 of the sacred texts was closed to readers, forever, by order of the Grand Master. She asked why. She was expelled. The very next day, without a trial, without explanation. For 10 years she lived in poverty and believed she had betrayed her God. Dan listened in silence. When Cordelia finished, he asked for Mira. Mira arrived 5 minutes later. She knew 14 languages, including the Order's sacred language. Cordelia took a book out of her travel bag, an old one, A worn one. She had stolen it on the night of her expulsion. She had carried it with her for 10 years. For 10 years, she hadn't been able to read the crossed-out text, because the crossed-out text was written in a language she didn't know. Mira opened the book. She found the crossed-out paragraph. She looked at it. Her silver hair fell onto the page. She said it was ancient Elvish, a dialect over 1,000 years old. She could read it. Mira translated. The crossed-out paragraph read as follows. If a breach is discovered in the Great Treaty that cannot be remedied by the parties to the treaty, the parties undertake to summon the external verifier, a being from a world not bound by this treaty. The external verifier is granted the authority to repair the breach. Upon completion of the repair, the external verifier shall be returned to its world of origin. All traces of its presence shall be erased. The silence in the room was such that Dan could hear the rain dripping from the eaves outside the window. He read the translation again. External verifier, a being from a world not bound by this treaty, subject to return, to annulment. He looked at the golden line on his arm. It glowed evenly, calmly, as always. He understood. Not with his mind, with his body. He was the external verifier. He wasn't transported here by accident. He was summoned. Just as a lawyer is summoned to a case, just as a specialist is called to a patient, the world found a crack in its foundation and called upon the one who knows how to repair contracts. And when he fixes it, when he seals the crack, they'll send him back, erase him, annul him, as if he'd never existed. Emily, Serafina, Ji-Yoon, Rosalinda, Mira, Bryn, Holt, Oren, everyone. They'll forget him, because he won't be there. Dan stood up. He walked to the window. Rain was pounding against the glass. Outside the window was Haven Rest Square, his city, his home, which he had spent a year and a half building, which he had defended from Cross, from Torvald, from murderers and swindlers. His office, his people,
his tea every morning, his nameplate on the door. Cordelia was looking at him. Mira was looking at him. They both saw that he understood. Dan returned to the table. He sat down. He picked up a pen. He said he needed to see the full text of the Great Treaty, every crack, every word, because he wasn't going to be a cog in a machine that they used and then discarded. He was a lawyer, and if the contract says he must be terminated after the work is done, then he'll find a clause in that contract that allows him to stay. Or he'll write an amendment. Or he'll find a loophole, because there are always loopholes. He's been doing this for 12 years. Cordelia said that the full text of the Great Treaty is located in a place called the core, the center of the world, the point where the three realities intersect.
It can be reached, but permission from all three parties is required: humans, gods, and the other side. Dan nodded. He said he would start with the humans, because with humans, at least, he can speak the same language. He took Cordelia's book. He read the crossed-out lines again. Then he took out a blank sheet of paper. He reconstructed the crossed-out text. He copied it into the sacred book. He sealed it with blood. A golden line flashed. The old black ink with which the paragraph had been crossed out faded. It faded away. It disappeared. Beneath them, the original text emerged, golden, bright, millennia old. Cordelia looked at the book, at the restored text, at her own words, which 10 years ago had cost her everything. She hadn't been wrong. She hadn't betrayed God. God had betrayed her. The order had crossed out the truth because the truth was inconvenient. She sank to her knees. Dan lifted her up. He said, "No kneeling. There were only chairs and tea here." Cordelia looked at him, and for the first time in 10 years, her calm eyes grew wet. She joined the team that very day. Spiritual advisor, specialist in superhuman contracts, guide to the great contract. That evening, Dan sat alone in his office. Everyone had left. Even Serafina, who usually stood by the door until the very last moment. He sat and looked at his hand, at the golden line. He thought about how this whole year, all these people, all those contracts and victories and morning tea and the nameplate on the door, it was all part of the mechanism. He had been summoned. He had been working. When the job was done, they would shut him down. He took out a blank sheet of paper. He picked up a pen and began to write a contract. Not for a client, for himself. For the first time in his life, he was signing for himself. I, Daniel Archer, reserve the right to exist in this world, regardless of whether or not I fulfill my duties as an external certifier. He hadn't certified it. Not yet. Because for this contract, he would need a second signature. The signature of the other party. The signature of the world. He put the sheet of paper in his desk drawer, locked it, and went to sleep. A sprig of mint lay on the pillow. Jiyun. He smiled, closed his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't dream of Manhattan's asphalt, but of Haven Rest Square bathed in the morning sun. The journey to the core took 3 weeks. Dan wasn't alone. Serafina walked to his left, a sword at her belt, eyes on the road. She didn't ask why they were going. She knew. Rosalind walked on the right.
In a raincoat over an expensive dress, she carried the documents, all the contracts, all the permits, all the passes required to cross 3 borders. Emily walked behind Dan and carried the archive. Not the whole thing, copies of key documents, Archer's registry, certificates, contracts. She refused to leave them at the office.
She said the archive was the office's memory, and you don't leave memories unattended. Ji-eun walked beside Emily. A bag of medicines, decoctions, ointments, needles, bandages. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew someone would need help. Someone always needs help. Mira walked ahead and translated the signs in Old Elvish. Without her, they would have gotten lost on the first day. Cordelia walked in silence. She knew the way. Not from a map, from the memory of her body. 20 years in the Order had taught her to sense the core as a sailor senses the north. Dan had received permission from Torvald. The Baron represented the human side of the treaty as a descendant of one of the original signatories. He granted permission without hesitation. He said that if Dan intended to repair the foundation of the world, it was in the interest of every person on the continent. Permission from the gods proved more difficult. Dan received it from the goddess of trade. She came to him herself. Not to the temple, to the office. A small woman with golden eyes. She said she had been watching him for a long time, from his first day in the square. She said he was a good lawyer, the best of those who had been summoned. 2 before him had died within the first day, 1 from shock, the second from despair. Dan survived because his last thought was of the contract. That made him compatible with a world held together by contracts. She gave her permission, but she warned him. The great contract is unlike any document he has ever seen. It is not parchment. It is the fabric of reality. The letters of which it is composed are not ink. They are the forces that hold the world together. A tear in such a document is not a hole in paper. It is a hole in existence. Dan said he understood. She looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled and said he didn't. He didn't understand. But he would when he saw it. The other side's permission was the strangest. Cordelia performed a ritual. A simple one. A candle. A drop of blood. A word spoken in a language Dan didn't know. A face emerged from the darkness behind the candle. Inhuman. Beautiful and terrifying at the same time. It asked one thing. What are you willing to lose? Dan answered without hesitation. Everything except the right to decide. The face smiled, or bared its teeth. Permission granted. The core turned out to be a cave, deep beneath the mountain in the center of the continent. They descended for half a day, stairs carved into the stone thousands of years ago. The walls were covered with inscriptions in languages that no longer existed. Mira read them in a whisper. Her eyes sparkled. For her, it was paradise. 14 languages, and here she had found the 15th. The cave was round. The walls were made of black stone. In the center stood a pillar, not made of stone, not wooden, a pillar of light. Dim, pulsating, like a heartbeat. Dan approached. He saw the text. Letters burned on the surface of the pillar, slowly rotating, appearing and disappearing. The Great Treaty. It was enormous. Thousands of clauses, millions of words, the agreement upon which the world stood. And he saw a crack. Not a metaphorical one,
A real one. A black line running through the text, like a crack in glass. It began at the clause about the balance between the three parties and spread downward, outward, a little more with every passing minute. Dan stepped closer. He read the text around the crack. His eyes burned gold. The glow was so bright that Seraphina took a step back. The clause on equilibrium stated that the three parties pledged to maintain a balance of power. No party may gain strength at the expense of another without the consent of the third. The crack ran through the word consent. Someone, sometime, centuries ago, had altered the meaning of this clause, had not crossed it out, had not rewritten it, just shifted one word. Consent became notification.
A difference of one word. But that word held the world together, because consent means that all three parties must agree, and notification means that one party can act and simply inform the others. Someone, centuries ago, granted one of the parties the right to alter the balance unilaterally, and that party exercised that right, slowly, quietly, for centuries, shifting the balance until the crack became visible. Dan stood before a pillar of light and looked at the one word that was destroying the world. One word. In his practice in Manhattan, a single comma had once cost a company $8 billion. Here, a single word cost an entire reality. He took out a quill, bit his finger. Blood fell onto the stone. The golden line on his hand flared up so that the entire cave turned golden. Seraphina closed her eyes. Emily grabbed Rosalind. Ji-Yun backed up against the wall. Mira stood and watched. Cordelia prayed. Dan brought the quill to the pillar. He crossed out the word notice and wrote consent over it. One movement, one word. The pillar trembled. The light grew brighter. The letters spun faster. A crack. A black line running through the text. It froze. Then it began to narrow. Slowly, like a wound closing. Dan stood and watched. His hand was burning. The golden line pulsed so strongly it felt as if his skin would burst. The crack closed. The text became whole. The pole glowed with an even light. The pulsing stopped. The world stopped cracking. Dan lowered his hand. The pen fell from his fingers. He stood before the pillar and waited to be erased, annulled, returned to the asphalt of Manhattan, or into the void. 1 second. 2. 3. 10. Nothing happened. He looked at the pillar. The text was still spinning, and he saw a new line, at the bottom, where the great treaty ended. A line that hadn't been there before. It read, Amendment. External certifier Daniel Archer, upon fulfilling his obligations, retains the right to exist in this world and is exempt from the return condition. Basis. The certifier's contract with himself dated such and such a date. Dan blinked. He hadn't certified that contract. He'd written it and put it in a desk drawer, unfinished, without a second signature. He looked at the column, at the new line, and understood. The world had signed for him. The world itself had become the second party, because the world didn't want to let him go. Not because it needed the mechanism, but because, over the course of a year and a half, the world had grown accustomed to a man who repaired it not as a machine,
but as a home, with care, with respect, with tea in the mornings. Dan stood in the cave beneath the mountain at the center of the world and looked at the line written in golden light on the fabric of reality. His name, in the foundation of the world, forever. Seraphina approached first.
She stood beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. Not a word, just a hand, heavy and warm. Rosalinda stood on the other side. Emily pressed herself against his arm and said nothing. Ji-yoon stood behind him. He could smell mint. Mira was smiling, quietly, with just their eyes. Cordelia stopped praying and simply stood nearby. They stood there for so long, in a cave beneath the mountain, in the center of a world that had just decided it needed this man. Then Dan turned. He looked at each of them, at Seraphina, who had spent 3 years searching for the truth and found it in his office, at Rosalind, who had been running from paper for 13 years and had stopped for the first time, at Emily, who didn't exist until he wrote her name, at Ji-yoon, who had paid a tax that didn't exist for 10 years and who, ever since, had set tea on his table every morning, at Mira, who had spoken her name aloud for the first time in his office, at Cordelia, who for 10 years thought she had betrayed God, but it turned out that God had betrayed her. He said it was time for them to go home. He said they had a lot of work to do tomorrow. They climbed out of the cave up ancient steps. Mira read the inscriptions on the walls. Emily took notes. Seraphina walked ahead and checked every turn. Rosalinda held Cordelia on the steep steps. Ji-yoon walked beside Dan and said nothing. They emerged onto the surface. Sun, wind, the smell of grass and earth. Haven Rest was a 3-week journey away. An office awaited them there. A sign on the door. A desk with an inkwell. Shelves with documents. A line at the entrance. People who needed help. Dan looked at his hand. The golden line glowed evenly and calmly. An old scar from a paper cut was barely visible beneath it. A scar from a past life. A line from a new one. For 12 years, he had drafted contracts in which every comma was worth millions. He thought that was his life. He was wrong. His life began on a dusty bench in the middle of a small town square. It began the moment he saw a woman with a child and a scroll glowing red. It began when he stood up and said, "May I take a look at this document?" A contract protects the weak. Otherwise, it's not a contract. It's shackles. He repeated this to himself every morning while brewing tea. And he'll repeat it tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and a year from now, because now he has a tomorrow. His name is inscribed in the foundation of the world. And next to that name stand the names of 6 women who taught him that a home isn't a building. A home is the people for whom it's worth signing contracts with yourself to prove you're still alive. The carriage was waiting on the road. Rosalinda opened the door. Emily climbed in first. Seraphina sat on the box. Ji-yoon handed Dan a mug. Tea. Hot. With mint. He took the mug, took a sip, and said one word. Home.